Hello, listeners, and welcome to part 2 of this mini series on seeking justice against sexual abuse in faith based groups. For early access to ad free full length episodes, you can head to patreon.com/the cult vault and support the show from as little as £1 a month. But for now, here is Carol M. Murchison. So, now that we have an understanding of how different parts of the law work, what sexual misconduct looks like and how it's evolved and changed, it's time to partner the two things together in terms of religion and faith-based groups. So when people say faith-based to me, we've mentioned America, Canada, the UK. I think predominantly in terms of the Western world, I think of Christianity. Have you worked on many cases linked to this major religion, or would you say that actually there's a lot of other groups involved that aren't necessarily Christian-based groups?
I would say both. So we have a case right now of a Christian-based group, and it's a child sexual assault case. Because New York has opened up its statutes of limitations, we're seeing a lot of cases of children who were abused, but who did not have a legal pathway to accountability because the statute of limitations, which is, for your listeners, the period of time in which you can actually bring a case. And so this is a constant challenge, but New York opened up their statute. And so, yes, we have a Christian case. However, when I think of faith-based communities or even spiritual communities, in addition to what I think of as the, kind of major religions that we might see in the West, I have certainly seen cases, several Buddhist cases, Buddhist communities, which always surprises people because they have a vision, a perhaps romanticized vision of Buddhism as being a peaceful, violent, non-threatening religion, which the teachings, of course, are. Because when I always feel like I need to say to folks that when we're talking about this, we're not necessarily talking about the teachings of any of these groups, which bring solace and strength and a lot of very positive things to people. We're talking about when the teachings are manipulated by a leader who has total control, sometimes a charismatic leader who is doing all those things that we're talking about. So I see much more cult-like activity in two areas. Well, three, I will say. One is Buddhism, which has come to the West and brought, as I said, many good things, but also, as many religions, completely what do I want to say? I don't want to say unsupervised, but it's like that. There is no controlling organization. And so people are free to do what they want. And when, as you said before you hit record, you and I were talking about how we fell into this work. And the way I fell into this work was that I read an article about a woman who was doing something that she called Buddhist Project Sunshine. And she was trying to provide a space for women to come forward, and men, by the way, in that situation, who had been abused within a particular Buddhist community in Canada and in Boulder, Colorado. And I don't know why I reached out to her. I wonder many days why I did, but I did. And I said to her, because the only thing I knew was how to investigate, right? I said, gee, they need to do with these or this kind of claim, they need to do an investigation. And she said, well, they're not speaking to me, so they're not going to do an investigation. And in a kind of just split second, well, I'm retired, I'm a lawyer, I've done investigations, that kind of impulse, I'll just look at what she has. And within weeks, something that neither she nor I knew at the time is that a number of women had been sexually assaulted by the leader of the organization, not just people within the organization. That was in 2018, I think, and it got a lot of press. Then the next thing I knew, someone came forward and said, well, would you do, I didn't know, I didn't even know that this was a thing, would you look at what has happened to this group of women? And I did that. Then I did a yoga investigation. I've done a number of Buddhist investigations of all kinds. And eventually what I saw is that what I was doing was giving voice to the women's stories, because as you know, cult organizations are not big on providing a forum for people to have a disagreeing opinion or another point of view. And so they had been silenced. They had been ostracized. Many of them had been thrown out of the organization or had to leave it. And I saw myself as giving voice and bringing that voice with some collaboration to the organization itself, to the cult organization, to say, you need to do better. You need to provide accountability. And I can tell you that in almost every case, I failed because they weren't interested in accountability, which is what led me to start saying that corporate America is doing better than Buddhist America, because a lot of the organizations who are engaged in this kind of sexual misconduct do not care. And then I met Ann Oliverius, and she had a law firm, and she was a fierce fighter for women's rights. And I started funneling these investigations to her because legal action was the only thing that was left. And then I joined her firm. And so there you are. That's what I had a 4-year pro bono project because I never charged any money, just because I could, because I could do it. And because, like you, probably it appealed to the kind of sense of justice and sense of trying to bring some kind of healing to people who were harmed.
What a journey that is to get to where you are now, all as somebody who was like, I thought I was retiring, and yet here I am.
Yes, but I feel, I feel on a daily basis. At the same time, anyone who's a lawyer, anyone who's ever been involved in litigation will tell you that there are many hard moments, and there are hard moments for lawyers as well, because particularly when we are invested in the health and well-being and the mental well-being of our clients, it is difficult. But I have to say that every day I feel absolutely grateful that I can do this work.
You mentioned earlier that religions should be a positive thing.
Yes.
And you also included that in the Equality Act, religion was added into the various different communities and groups that should be treated equally in terms of employment opportunities, at least. And I know things have changed as well, but religions, they should be positive because get to they get the benefits of being recognized faith-based groups and communities, including things like tax breaks and exemptions, including things like being a part of the Equality Act, not being drafted into war. There's lots of things that come with that title. And this is where I struggle, because I recognize through my work recently that not all faith-based groups are destructive. Some are very positive communities. Some are only positive communities because they recognize that religious trauma happens, because they recognize that there is not a lot of recognition or space for the LGBTQIA plus community in a lot of religious and faith-based spaces. So how come there is no protection inside religious groups when they are when they're basically protected by government law, by things that are written in law? It just I really can't articulate what I'm trying to say, and I think you might be able to a lot better, but it's frustrating.
Yes, it is. I know I'm shaking my head here, Casey, which your listeners can't see, but I'm shaking my head because I have all of the, kind of similar feelings. Like these are organizations that are protected in the United States. They're not only protected, you can't be discriminated or harassed on the basis of your religion. And I think that's a good idea. They are protected by the First Amendment. So you are free to practice your religion, which is where we get very close to what we're talking about with cults, right? Because they are practicing something that is harmful. And as you said, it is very irksome to me that they get tax breaks and all other kind of financial benefits, and in many cases do not give back to the communities that they're living in. That's not the case in all religious groups, of course, but a fair number, I would say, do not. And so, yes, all of that is quite aggravating to me. Here is how we deal with it from a legal perspective. We very much have to separate out the religious belief from the actions. So, this is the reason that I've been talking about what I'm doing very specifically as sexual assault, sexual misconduct in faith-based or spiritual communities, with a focus on the sexual assault part, because sexual assault is illegal. And so when we're litigating these things, we are not talking about belief, we are talking about action. And so you don't get a free pass to murder people, just to give an extreme example, because you dream up that your religion allows you to do that. If you were to say, let's say you were walking down the street and you said, I believe that Satan is abiding in that person, so I'm going to take out my gun and I'm going to shoot them. Well, it's not the belief that we're attacking, it's the action. And so where we have laws that protect the action, that's what we go for. And this is at the heart of what I feel is the difficulty for cult survivors, is that sexual assault is not the only harm that is done. There's financial harm, there's psychological harm, there's so many different harms, but there's no legal pathway for those, or let's just say they're extremely limited if they exist. And so what only thing we can do is to go over the action, that deal with the action that is illegal. So that's where we have to start. Is the action illegal? Because that gives, then what we're not attacking religion or beliefs, we're attacking action. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm thinking of so many different things as you talk about not attacking the belief, but looking at what is illegal and taking action on what is, I don't know, provable, or in
Yes.
a, because financial coercion or extortion, in some cases, you might be able to look at that and say, wow, this con artist managed to get this much money from me. There are cases where I'm sure you could do that, but it's tricky. So
It
I'm
is.
kind of working through as you explain it,
Mhm.
but then I'm thinking it gets even more difficult even then. And I imagine you've come up against this, where individuals who were born and raised in religious groups and faith-based groups don't realize that sexual assault and rape is illegal It's normalized to them. It's expected from them. And that in turn does become their belief system. So
Yes, it
how
does.
do you untangle those things as well, Carol? That must be
Yes.
so tough.
Well, I think what is difficult is that awareness piece that we talked about before, when people are isolated and where they are second generation and they have not had any exposure to anything outside of that a particular cult-like organization with which to challenge that belief. And so the difficulty is this, that those people do not come forward because they don't ever know. So that those people who do come forward, because there's been some kind of an aha moment for them, those people are, they're just heroic in my mind, because they are leading a charge for thousands of other people who don't know. And if we keep it under a rock, if we keep it swept under the rug, then they will never know. But sometimes that knowledge gets in. It does. Somehow or another, a seed gets planted. I will give you an example. Without using any names, an organization in which absolutely the leader was a pedophile. And as you suggested with with your other example, was grooming and sexually assaulting children. There was an article in a magazine about this in the 90s. And the people who were in the cult were told these people are evil, they're the devil trying to get us and destroy us. And many of them, at least the ones that I now know, believed that. But eventually other things happened. And that little piece of knowledge of that article stayed in the unconscious, and it came out later and became part of a whole, almost like a jigsaw puzzle of pieces that they were able to put together. So I feel that every piece of public information has the opportunity to plant a seed that gets heard, seen, talked about somehow, exactly so that those folks that you're talking about begin to question what has been taught to them.
There's been a lot of cases recently that you may have even been involved in, which is a really interesting thing to consider, around organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, where historical cases of covered up and hidden child sexual abuse are the cases are now coming to the forefront in different states, in different countries. So if we speak specifically about the US, and I think it's Pennsylvania most recently, there were some elders that were charged for sexually assaulting children in various kingdom halls. Are you up to date with these types of cases? Are you involved in any of these cases? And again, is the statute of limitations different state to state? So there might be cases where even if it becomes public record that there's been covered up cases of sexual abuse, that nothing might be able to come of it.
First of all, I can't comment, on any cases that I'm involved in, but I know exactly what you're talking about. And so let me say, what I can tell you is about the statute of limitations, because this is the very first, I think of like getting to the starting line of a legal case as having to run and jump over those hurdles, like the track people do, they're running and they jump over a big hurdle. That's the first hurdle, is the statute of limitations. limitations. And it is different state to state in the United States. Now, let me just say, in case you have any Canadian listeners tuned in, that Canada has no statute of limitations. This is an enlightened society up there in the north of the United States, a country who recognizes that trauma takes time to process. 10 years, 20 years, 40 years would not be uncommon. We know this. People like Dan Shaw, who are, therapists and psychologists who are dealing with this, tell us that. We know it. And Canada has responded to that by eliminating their statute of limitations in sexual assault cases. So that is a truly enlightened government and society. In the United States, it goes state by state. So, and it's incredibly complicated. Before I started working for Anne, I could not have even imagined how incredibly complicated that it is, because I had never encountered this. But so let me say that first, each state has its own statute of limitations for the state law claims, like sexual assault is a state law claim. And those statute of limitations can be extremely short or longer. It depends on whether you were a child when you were assaulted, because we have reached a level of enlightened thinking where we know that children have a very hard time coming forward. They don't have language for what happened to them. They are like your second generation example. They don't know that what happened to them was wrong until much later and so we typically see longer statutes of limitations on sexual assault against children. However, what I would say is the very same thing that we would say about a child also happens to adults. And particularly it happens to adults who are in cult-like organizations, because they don't have language for it. You gave the perfect example earlier of the second gen person who's been raised with this to feel that this is normalized. And so whether you're a child or an adult, the statutes of limitations need to be longer. Now, some states have gone to longer statutes, but not long enough, in my view. In addition, some states, and New York is one, California is one, Colorado is one, they are opening up Colorado abolished statutes of limitations, but it doesn't go back. It's not retroactive. It's going forward. California has had a series of what I would call an open window. So they've opened the door and said, during this year, and this is happening in New York right now, for example, in this year, beginning November 2023 until November 2024, if you were sexually assaulted in New York as an adult, we don't care when it was. That window will close in November. And then those assaults will no longer have a legal path to justice. Does that make sense? So it's completely unorganized, disorganized,
No coherence.
and on a state by state basis. Federal law, and the human trafficking law in the United States is a federal law. The human trafficking law is 10 years, but President Biden just in October said that going forward, there will be no statute of limitations for children who come under the human trafficking law. I think the activism there is that it also needs to be expanded to adults who come under the human trafficking law for exactly the same reasons.
In one of these cases with the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, if an individual is sexually abused in one state, they can't go to another state where there is differing statute of limitations and say, well, if I can't sue you in this state, I'll sue you in this state instead.
Well, so now I'm going to introduce you to a favorite phrase that lawyers use. It depends. So, in fact, we used to joke that, lawyers spend 3 years in law school learning all different ways to say how to say it depends. So here's why it depends. Generally speaking, you're right but what if the organization was headquartered in another state? So each state, if you think about it, in the United States is saying, why should I use my resources in the court system to adjudicate this case? And so there has to be a reason. One of the big reasons is, of course, because the action took place in my state. But there are other reasons. It could be that being headquartered in the state is one, so maybe the group has its headquarters in one state and you go to another state. So it's the kind of thing that's not easily analyzed, as just a simple yes or no, hence the it depends. But basically, I know in our Canada cases, that we have several plaintiffs involved who were not assaulted in Canada. But we believe that we have good legal reasons based on the law in Canada where Canada should say, yes, I should use my judicial resources to adjudicate this case on behalf of this person. One of them is that the leader of the group went to another state, assaulted the person, and was there, so to speak, on business, and then went back to Canada. And so that's a reason why Canada might take what's called take jurisdiction over the case.
Okay.
So there's a lot of, and of course, this is where lawyers try to get creative and look for all of the reasons why, in this case, the court should take that case. So I wouldn't say no, it could never be. I would say it's a kind of a caution that there's another little jump that has to, be gone over.
Would you say then that in this circumstance, this is where politics comes into play? Because if people are hoping to get elected, re-elected, if attorney generals want to make names for themselves, they'll say, if you want to try that case over here, which I think will get a lot of publicity, which I think if we win will make me look great, we will use our money to put this case through our state system.
Well, so it should not go that way. I would never say that something either does or doesn't go that way, but it shouldn't go that way. So, because first of all, those district attorneys and the attorney general of the different states are working on the criminal justice system. I mean, that they might, and I absolutely think that on the criminal side, a district attorney may say, this is a case that we need to take because as an issue of public policy, we want to resolve this. So yes, I think that happens. On the civil side, the judges should be looking at the law. And now, of course, every one of us is influenced by our own experiences and our own views of life. And so they're no different. But that's where their decision-making should come from.
Right. The reason I asked that question is because I was thinking in regards to Utah, which I understand is a whole state unto itself at this point over in America in terms of law and lawsuits and religious groups and breaking the law and sexual abuse cases and everything else that comes under the umbrella of Utah. That in the Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey documentary that came out on Netflix recently, there was case upon case that was looked at by law enforcement that wasn't pursued, of forced child marriages, of forced polygamy, which is illegal, of rape and sexual abuse. It was rife, and there were so many cases of it. But it seemed as though it was only picked up by certain key players in the justice system when it looked like it could favor certain people in political positions. And I guess that feeds in really nicely at looking into human trafficking laws, because that is one of the things that eventually landed Warren Jeffs behind bars.
Yes. And Keith Raniere too. So yes, so look, the criminal justice system, because if we go back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is that the criminal justice system, the players in it, the lawyers in it, are government. They're hired, they're employees of the government. And so there are many factors that influence their thinking. And so I know, I mean, in a lot of cases, not the kinds of cases that you're talking about, but in a lot of cases, for example, where we have a rape case, we feel that we have the criminal justice system does not take nor convict. Well, it's just a huge percentage of rape cases which are not ever put into the system, partly because people don't want to come forward to the system because they've been mistreated by the police. They've not been treated in a trauma-sensitive way. The whole system feels geared against them. But there are reasons why a district attorney would not take a rape case to trial. They don't want to take a case that they will lose because they're making bad law. They're setting a precedent. And there are lots of reasons that they might lose, not having to do with the strength or the truth of the victim. Now, when we talk about Utah, and I was just telling you about judges having their own their own life experiences. Well, when you have a state which has a predominant religion, then you have a lot of people within the system that share that religion, and they don't view it in the same way. That's the only thing, that I can say about that. In addition, I will tell you in addition to what you're talking about in Utah, there is so much evidence of criminal activity in so many of these cults. I have personally called the FBI myself about one of them that I happen to have evidence of, and I don't even get a call back. And so I guess what I'm saying is that we know that these cults are out here doing a lot of things. I think that it is because our system is either overtaxed, there aren't enough people, there isn't the concern, there are other higher priorities. I don't know what it is. I wish I knew what it was. But it's not just in Utah that these things are being ignored. And that is one of the reasons that the federal law is very important, because it is it can be tried in a state court, but it is a federal law that is applicable across all the different states. The thing that I think of when I think of the human trafficking law is that in the United States, in the South, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, when people were marching for civil rights, then it was the federal government and the federal laws that became important in empowering that fight, not state laws, because the states saw things in a particularly racist way in some states. And so it required federal governments to come in and federal laws to be enforced for there to be any momentum. And I hope for that in cults, because I think the human trafficking law, the federal law, is really made for cults because it has to do with enticing or recruiting someone to perform a sex act that benefits somebody by fraud or coercion. So doesn't that sound like what happens? in these cults by fraud
Sounds
or coercion.
it sounds exactly like what happens. And the cynical part of me thinks that perhaps these religious groups aren't pursued by law enforcement in the way that they should be, despite evidence being provided about crimes against them, is because of the protection that religious groups have, the status that religious
Yes,
groups have. It's kind of like
yes,
it's kind of like you saying, say you vouch for someone. Oh, I vouch for that person. They're great. Let them have all these benefits of joining our friendship group. Whatever those benefits are. You get board game nights on a Tuesday and you cook dinner for everyone on a Saturday, whatever it looks like. They can join our friendship group. I vouch for them. And then they turn out to be somebody really awful. And then you're sitting there looking really silly and you have to be held accountable because it was your suggestion. The government has given all of these protections to religious groups,
yes,
and if law enforcement pursue all of the crimes that these protected groups are committing, who does it look bad on? It looks bad on the institution that gave these groups the protections and the tax exemptions to begin with.
yes.
I don't know. I
Indeed,
just
it
get
does.
frustrated.
No, I completely understand that because look, I've had people tell me that they have gone to law enforcement with what is clearly sexual assault. It meets the definition of sexual assault, and have police say to them, "We can't do anything about it because it's a religious group." Now that is just wrong. First of all, it's wrong advice because you can. It's action, not belief. We don't get a pass, go collect $200 because you're a religious group. You simply don't. But we have too many people who are frightened of the power that we have given them in the United States. And absolutely, I had a woman tell me that she went to the police to tell them about what was happening to her daughter. And first of all, they said it's consensual. Okay, so now there can be no consent. So, in case this hasn't, come up in any of your podcasts, there can be no consent in these power imbalance relationships. There can't be. That's why I love the human trafficking law. It's because it's not about consent. It's about what happened. What did the perpetrator use to manipulate the other person, not about whether they consented to it. So there should be no issue of consent when a person is, let's say, in some of the yoga ashrams that I have investigated, where people are there, have been there for years, make no money, work for free, and then are sexually assaulted, there is nothing that they can do about it because they don't have enough money to get out of the ashram. No less, and of course, no one within the ashram would listen because what they say is that's the teacher. He can do no wrong. So if he harmed you, it's you that's wrong. So of course, what are you going to do about that? Nothing. You have no options. So consent is not an issue from my point of view. Sometimes a survivor will come forward and say, I know that it looked like I consented. I never think it looks like people consented because that's consent is a kind of free will, like having choices. And in these situations of fraud and coercion, there is no choice.
I think that's where some of the cases on co-conspirators of cult leaders are really difficult as well. I was reading recently that Linda Kasabian, who was a member of the Manson family, recently passed away. And it makes me think about those that followed him that are still incarcerated. And there's this big debate on whether they should be or not. And it's tough.
Yes,
It's a very tough discussion to have because of coercion and because of, what was done of someone's own free will and what wasn't, and even under duress or coercion, you still can't commit murder. So it's a really tough one.
I think that it's again, uh, they were victims as well in many ways. I think that's what you're saying, you
Yeah.
know. Um, and again, I think that maybe the line in the sand has to be action. When you take the gun and you kill, when you take the knife and you stab, that is an action. We can perhaps understand that you were a victim of it as well, but we seem to be a society that, at least to some extent, feels that you have to pay for your actions.
There's the big discussion around on whether people who have parole hearings should be released because they've served time for the crimes they committed, and because they're no longer under the influence of the person that perhaps coerced them to commit those crimes in the first place. Are they still a threat to the public? Some people say yes, some people say no, and then you're back to having that argument after the fact. Even though you're not talking about the crimes the person has committed, you're now talking about the crimes that they may commit, even though Charles Manson is dead. So this is I'm kind of taking us off topic, but it's stuff that's still really interesting to me to just try and unpack and understand. But you mentioned that there are some yoga groups you've worked with, some Buddhist groups. What
Yes.
size are the faith-based communities that you typically find yourself working with? Are they massive groups, small groups? Do you work with like family groups and one-on-one groups?
So the answer is yes to all of it practically. Although I haven't worked with like a family domestic situation. But what I would say is that I've worked with a very large group. So the one of the Buddhist groups is a very large community. I think someone said they had 10,000 members. So that's extremely large, long history in the United States as well, at least decades. The yoga groups that I've worked with have been large also. But as you know, some of these cult organizations are quite small. So we're seeing more as we as we look at the landscape ahead of us, in front of us, what we see is that there are, someone said, I don't know if this is true, 10,000 cults in the United States alone. And I would guess that a lot of them are very, very small. And so we just talked with a woman, for example, who was in a cult of 8 people. So I don't look at size. I look at the action. Of course, I have to look at the obstacles because we never want to take a survivor down a path that's going to be potentially harmful and have no possibility of success. So I look at the statute of limitations. I look at the actions to see if there is a law that says you can't do that, because we can't focus on the religious beliefs. And the third thing that I focus on, which sounds kind of strange but is not really a surprise, is assets. So if in the civil justice system, the currency is money, but the cult has no money, then we can't take a person down that path because there will not be any success. And so those are the kinds of obstacles that we look at.
Do you find that the groups that you are contacted by, or the groups that you work with, are splinter groups that get slightly more damaging and extremist and destructive the further away from the major religion that they found themselves, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, no, that's an interesting question. Um, what I have seen is that in the uh, religious and faith-based communities that have lineages, where you have your original teacher, and then you are, you are like the mentee of that teacher, and then you get your own group. Yes, I think that what you're saying is a possibility. What I have also seen, though, is that the original teacher was corrupt in his actions. So I'm thinking of the groups of teachers who present themselves as celibate. As soon as I hear that word, I have a very have a cynical reaction like you do, Casey, to some of these things. I am thinking, yeah, but no. I'm thinking, but maybe not. And in fact, many of the groups that I have been involved with have been with teachers who were, and I'm using, air quotes around the word celibate, because they are not celibate. And yet the designation of celibacy has given women, particularly, although again sometimes men, the sense that they are safe there. Here is the sense of security, because this is a man, and what I know is, and you said it earlier, that power imbalance that we have in society makes women vulnerable to harm in that way. So here is a place where I am not going to be vulnerable to harm, because this leader and the people around him are celibate. But guess what? They are not. And so it's a kind of a double whammy, if you will. It's a confusion about what that is when you've been taught about celibacy, you've taken certain vows of celibacy, and then you find yourself assaulted by the teacher who's been teaching celibacy. It's very confusing.
By design, I imagine, as well, because victims always talk about, I was confused. I didn't really understand what was happening. It didn't feel right. I didn't enjoy it, but I didn't know how to say no because, if I say no to any sort of sexual interaction with my teacher turns around and says, I'm celibate. So it's
Yeah,
almost gaslighting somebody before the event has even taken place.
it absolutely is. And of course, gaslighting is the right word for what happens in these communities. So when from the top to the bottom, the gaze is upward, and there is this unwavering belief in the rightness of the teacher, and the unwavering belief that the teacher cannot be wrong, and if he harms you, that you are the one who is wrong, is another enormous gaslighting situation. That's why, in fact, some of the survivors that have been through the civil justice system find some solace in it. I just talked to a man the other day who was assaulted as a child in a religious organization, and he's not a client of mine, but he is somebody that I know and have kept in touch with, and his case has been 2 years trying to get over one legal hurdle, about whether the law is retroactive and therefore allows him to bring a claim. And I said to him, are you frustrated by how long this is taking? And I was so surprised. He said to me, no, I'm not frustrated at all. He said, I feel liberated. I feel liberated because I am fighting back. And I may lose, but I have fought. And I thought, wow, that is a perspective that I hadn't expected. And so I hold on to that. thinking that maybe not being silenced, like maybe even in this case, the fact that the courts of the state that he is in I think that there have been 1, 2, 3, 5 hearings, and it's going up to the Supreme Court of the state that he is in because they are listening to him. It's a completely, the legal issue involved doesn't have anything to do with him, but he is bringing that fight, and it's liberating.
That is the end of part 2 of this mini-series. For more information on Carol and her work, you can check out the links in the episode description. And to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.